Hello! You've probably seen these acrylic markers out there already, but Arrtx sent me some too, and I'm going to give these a thorough review. I can already say this box has some weight behind it. It's a big set of 72 pens. Let's get into it! The first thing I'll say is Arrtx have been knocking it out of the park with their packaging. This is a really lovely looking box, and it's got that paisley retro design that they've been putting on their watercolour sketchbooks too. I really love the colours, the pastel pinks and blues. It is a big box, it's heavy. Compared with their other set which I've reviewed with the 60 brush markers, that box is a bit skinnier and a lot lighter. The new ones that I'm going to show today are much heavier, and that's because the pens themselves have a lot more paint in them from what I gather. Now, I absolutely love those brush markers, so I'm curious to know how these new ones are going to go today. They are quite different, and I just need to get this lid off because we need to see what's inside. I was being careful here because there are a few extra pieces. There's a welcome swatch chart because I always like to fill those in and not have to write everything out myself. And then we have all of the pens with colour numbers on the lids to match the order on the swatch card. Now they also have some extra nibs, and this is where things start to get quite complicated, far more so than the other brush markers that I have. These aren't actually brush markers as we'll see, but there is a brush included. Let me just show you the pen first. They're really pretty, love that design on them, they look fantastic, and they have wide barrels. The nibs that come with them are 3mm, so they're quite chunky, and they work like a standard paint marker where you have to pump the nib to get the paint down, and of course shake the pen too, so there's no paint in the nib at the moment. And these nibs are actually removable, as you can see here, which is actually a good thing because paint markers do tend to clog up after a while, and just looking down there you can see that the paint is going to feed through. So this bit's all fine and dandy. Paint markers have been around for a number of years, so they're not trying to reinvent the wheel. However, they've added some other nibs in here, and in that little bag there are 8 medium-sized nibs, and then there's a whole bunch of these brush nibs. Now mine had fallen out of the bag and they're all through the box, and I had quite a task here trying to dig them out because they'd all fallen down and I couldn't get my fingers in there. I really didn't want to have to pull all the pens out and lose the order of them, so I will get to those eventually. But the idea is that the nibs are interchangeable, and this is really great in theory, but I have experienced some flaws, and I'm going to tell you about those too because I want this to be a fully honest review. The biggest issue I see is that it only comes with 34 replaceable nibs, and there are 72 pens. Now, if they had 72 brush nibs that you could replace all of them with, this would be a lot better. Of those 34 replacements, 8 of them are medium-size 1.2mm round tips. Now, while I'm struggling to get these loose tips out, I think my biggest feedback to Arrtx would be that the set would be absolutely awesome if it had 72 of the brush nibs and 72 of the medium-sized nibs. So then there's the option of having all of the pens with the same size nibs that you could then put in before you actually activate the pens. The idea with these is that you can change them when the nib is actually painty, and you're going to see that it's quite a messy process. So I managed to get all of the extra nibs out, and before I swatch everything I will just get one pen activated so you can see what it looks like. This is with the 3mm nib that it came with in the pen. I'll worry about those other ones later. So you basically shake the pen, give it a few gentle pumps, and you can see the paint will start to flow down through that nib. I found all of the pens really easy to activate. There's lots of juicy paint, and there were no problems having to pump the pens for hours trying to get the paint to feed through. It came through really easily. I was just matching up the numbers here to make sure I was swatching the right little circle, and this particular one is kind of an odd one out. It's the only metallic that isn't gold or silver. It's this gorgeous red colour, and it is so lovely. I kind of wish they had some more metallic colours in this set. I'll swatch everything out in a moment, but I just want to demonstrate what you're meant to do with these pens. Now, the nib is all painty, but I want to swap it to a smaller one, a choice of this medium-sized or one of the brush nibs. There are 26 of these in the set. And I'm not going to lie, if they had 72 brush nibs, I would have replaced them all immediately before I activated them and just had brush pens. But anyway, I'm going to do it the way that they've shown. So here's the 3mm one. I've got some water here. You're meant to pull it out with a tissue and then dump it in the water and then cry over all of that beautiful paint that runs out into the water and not on my paper. Even though I didn't pay for the pens, it still absolutely kills me to waste ink like that. At least it feels like a waste to me. But I'm just going to do it anyway because I need to demonstrate them. This medium-sized nib pumps in exactly the same way as the 3mm one, and you can see the ink running down into it, so that's all ready to go. They're actually really similar. I think this one's a 2mm rather than a 1.2, which it says on the website. But wow, look at all that colour. It's like a little piece of my soul bleeding out into that water there. And I'm a clumsy person. This was such a messy process, although I managed to clean that first nib up and I can probably use it again. So if your paints do clog, you can soak them in water and then use a replacement nib, which is a good idea. It's just, I don't like to have to do this every time I want to use a different nib. I'm lazy and clumsy. That sort of thing doesn't work for me. Now with these brush nibs, they have a bit of plastic around them, and I was actually using the lid to push that piece of plastic rather than the soft nib itself so that I could retain the point as long as possible. I have seen a couple of people pumping with the nib, but I couldn't bring myself to do that, so another YouTuber had shown this particular technique and it worked out okay. I decided to put brushes in both the black and the white because I do tend to use these for lining more than larger areas, and it's so much easier to pull out those nibs when they're clean and not covered in paint. The one downside with the brush nibs is it's just a bit harder to pump them, and it took quite a lot longer, but I was being very careful not to squish the end of it. I couldn't decide which other colours to use with the brush nibs, so I just decided in the end to keep the original nibs on all of them, and if I need to change them, I'll do so in the future. But oh my gosh, I've just got paint everywhere. The interchangeable nib system is probably not the best thing for clumsy, messy people like me. Oh my gosh, I just managed to get it everywhere. But anyway, I got this one going as well, and I really like the brush nibs. Although later on I've noticed that the tip on the black one is starting to fray because I've used it quite a lot, so they are fairly delicate and require a lighter hand. But otherwise they're beautiful. I really like those brush nibs, and I made such a mess of my desk. Oh my gosh, I had paint everywhere and I had to keep cleaning it. But anyway, I'm going to swatch out the white one, and at this point I'd had enough of changing nibs around, so I'm just going to swatch out all the other colours, but first I've got to pump them all. Oh gosh, that took forever. Mainly because there are 72 pens, but the ink came down smoothly and I started swatching in all of the colours. Aside from my critique of the interchangeable nibs, the pens themselves are actually really lovely, and they put out an incredibly juicy load of paint onto the paper here. These have a lot more paint in them than the brush markers that I've reviewed in the past. Although I do actually prefer the other brush markers because the paints are all ready to go with it in the nibs, and you don't actually have to pump them or anything. They're just so super easy to use, and they're one of Arrtx's best products, at least in my opinion. But these pens, although they do require a bit more work to get going, they're a lot paintier than the other brush markers. They have a lot more ink in them, or paint. I found these ones a bit easier to blend together, and I'll show that when I do my artworks on some wood circles. I love the colour palette in this set. There's a nice range of all of the different colours in the spectrum, including some really pretty pinks and some pastel colours along with brighter ones. So there's a wide range to choose from, and you can do quite a lot of different kinds of arts with these, including a few that are more like skin colours. So overall it's a really versatile colour palette. There's lots of blues and greens, and in a while you'll see the brown and grey tones as well, so there are some nice neutral colours. These are all standard colours pretty much, except for the last three, which are metallics. There are no neons or anything like that. I'm always happy when there are extra metallic colours, but that's not particularly a deal breaker for me. It's got gold and silver, which are generally the ones that I use the most anyway. It's just funny that it has that red one and not like a blue or a green. Maybe they'll expand on those in the future. Looking at their website, the description says there's about 6 grams of ink in each pen. They're waterproof, of course, being acrylic, and they're not supposed to fade at all. They're designed to dry quickly, although because it's the middle of winter and also because these pens put out a lot of paint, they did actually take a bit longer to dry than I was anticipating, but not too long. And I didn't mind the slightly longer drying time because it gave me time to actually blend the pens together a bit more, which was quite fun. You can see here I've reached the earth and grey tones, so there's quite a lot of variety in those greys especially, which I really love. There's nice warm and cool ones, and then there's a couple here which I think are skin tones that are next to the black. And then we will come into those last two metallics, silver and gold, and here we go with a finished swatch sheet. I've let these all dry, and you can see that they dry nice and flat and opaque, which is what paint pens are meant to do, except for those three metallics which are nice and shiny in that corner there. You know me, I love the shiny paints. But let's do some actual artworks with these pens and see how I go with them. I bought these wood circles from Amazon, and I'll link them in the description below, along of course with the paint markers, which I will have there too. These wood slices were a bit dusty from the bark that was coming off a little bit. They're very natural ones, that's for sure. I'd never really drawn on wood slices before, so I thought I would get a pack, and I think there's 25 in there to try out. I've got some of my clear gesso because the wood felt quite porous, and I was thinking the pens might just soak into it and I'd have to do multiple layers. This brush was not cooperating, the bristles were stiff with paint, and I actually ended up switching to a nicer brush. I'm going to deal with my gross brushes in a future video. And you can see I managed to chip off a bit of that bark there, so these are a little bit fragile, but I'm really glad I put some gesso on there because it was as I thought. It actually soaked in quite a lot, and I was far too impatient with this first one. You can see the wood's a darker colour, and that's because the gesso hasn't fully dried. I needed to actually put a second coat of gesso on, but I just really wanted to try these pens out because it was the end of the day and I was getting a bit grumpy because I hadn't done any artwork, so I just went on top of it with them, and they worked out pretty well for the most part. They absorbed in a little bit, but not too badly. This is kind of my test piece, and I'm just doing a sunset over water, a bit of a cliche one. I've done this kind of thing before, but it was a nice way to test out different colours in a gradient and actually blending them together a little bit. I was working fairly quickly, so the paint was still quite wet, and I kept building up layers, blending the colours in together as I was doing so. You can also use a brush to blend, but I was just using the pens themselves to see how much of a blend I could get. It's not completely perfect, but it still worked out quite well in the end, and the paints themselves are nice and bright, and also pretty opaque for the most part. I enjoyed working on the wood because you can see the growth circles kind of showing through the painting, and it leaves a really interesting pattern. It's also a flat surface, so it's just like working on a canvas or piece of paper really, not too difficult, just a bit rougher, so I was being quite gentle with these pens, not putting too much pressure on the nib so they wouldn't get worn down on that rougher surface, especially the brush nibs. I was very careful with those. And this one took a bit longer to dry because I was adding so many layers, but also because that gesso wasn't perfectly dry. I love the brush nibs, and I know they have other sets with brush nibs on them, but I would be perfectly happy if this whole set were entirely brush nib markers as well. This is my own personal preference. I know other people like the broader nibs, in which case this set may well be perfect for you. The black paint was feathering a bit here because the underlayer wasn't quite dry, but eventually it came together, and I just drew a few little trees and a bit of a silhouette in the front to tie the whole picture together. A little bit of grass there. Nothing too complicated, but I actually really like how this test piece turned out, and the colours look lovely and bright. So I learned my lesson from this, and I decided to put gesso on the other ones before I finished up for the day so that they would dry completely overnight and be ready to use the following day. I picked out 4 and just decided that was how many I was going to attempt to paint. And I'm layering on a fairly thick amount of gesso here in 2 layers so that none of the paint markers will absorb into the wood afterwards. And you could use white or black gesso, any colour gesso. I just happened to have this clear stuff, plus I wanted to see the wood underneath. The pens performed a lot better on that gessoed surface, and for this first one I decided to pick out a bunch of purples and a couple of pinky colours, and it ended up being a geode because I was inspired by the rings in the wood and I was following those as a pattern. This was a made up one. I wasn't using any references for this. I was just enjoying painting on different colour purples in kind of a pattern and then repeating the same colours a couple of times along with the magenta colours to kind of break up the purple so it all wasn't completely monochromatic. These 3mm nibs worked really well on the wood and they're a bit hardier than the brush ones. And actually they're perfectly fine to use, it's just that it can be a bit harder to get those finer details, whereas a brush gives you a really fine point and the ability to make some broader strokes as well. But I find with a broader nib like this that I tend to go bolder, and that's a nice effect that you generally get with a lot of paint markers. I was trying to colour in the bark, but that didn't work very well, so I just left that bit, and I'm going over a few little areas to touch them up. And then I decided I wanted some silver, but I'm actually going to swap the nib out for one of those brush nibs, and I only put a tiny bit of water in so I can then use that paint water to put on a piece of paper and make a background. This was a great idea, except I got it all over the desk. So like I said before, these nibs are probably not the best for clumsy people. But I did enjoy using the brush marker with the silver, and I was able to get some thinner outlines and just make the whole thing look a lot shinier and more geode-like, I guess. I've watched some other YouTubers using these pens and giving favourable reviews on the interchangeable nibs. I just don't think it's for me. It's just a bit too much messing about and I don't like dealing with all of the nibs in the water, so that's definitely a personal preference, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments as to what you think of them. And here's this finished little geode. It's very shiny, it's a little messy as well, but I actually really like how it came out, and the circular pattern goes well on the circular piece of wood. I of course got silver all over my hands. Once I cleaned up, I was on to my next piece of wood, and I'm drawing a rose. I did actually use a reference here, and I decided I really wanted to go for yellow colours, although in hindsight those are probably the most difficult ones to blend together because they're all quite light. So I did end up using a little bit of orange as well, and it looks like a mess to begin with. I was really just trying to get the shapes of the petals and then work my way up to blending them. So I started off with a darker colour and then I'm going for a lighter one, and then I will just sort of blend them all together to try and get something a little more cohesive. I didn't think this was going to turn out to start with, but it actually came out quite well, and yeah, it was just a matter of layering and layering until I was happy. I decided to get the background in so I could actually see the rose a bit better, and I went for a plain green colour. So now I'm just fixing up a lot of my little mistakes, or it felt like mistakes at the time, just trying to blend two colours of yellow together while the paint is still wet on the wood. I couldn't achieve a seamless blend like I usually can with a paintbrush, but it was pretty close, and I'm actually quite surprised and happy with how painterly this one turned out, because a lot of paint pens do dry very quickly or they don't have a lot of ink coming out of them, so it's really difficult to blend them. These ones are a little bit easier because of that juicy ink flow. And I feel in that respect that these markers are a bit more versatile than some of the other ones that I've tried. I don't think I actually showed it, but there is a little window on the side of the pen that you can see the ink inside and how much is left, which I think is a really nice touch as well. And I'm hoping these ones will last a bit longer than some of the others I've had, which don't have as much ink in them and tend to dry up very quickly. And I couldn't help myself, I had to get the gold pen out, and I decided to outline all of the petals because it just really wasn't standing out that much, and I wanted to make it pop a little more. And look how shiny that gold is, it's so pretty. I also added in some of the white using the thinner brush nib, and I will just wrap it all up here and show you the finished product, which I'm really happy with this one. I love the colours and I love that gold. It's a lovely shiny one. And that's just one layer of green. You can see how much coverage it has without any patchiness, so I'm impressed with that too. Next picture, and I decided to do something super simple and cutesy. a little Ammonita Mushroom, which of course is completely stylized. Someone in the comments once asked me what it is about artists and drawing mushrooms. I guess it's because they are fun to do and they look really cute, so that's really my only reason. They're fun. But I also like colouring in with red and then putting the white spots over the top for contrast. Now, I've been thinking about these pens and storing them, whether the box should be sitting upright or if it should lay on its side. From everything I've read, and this includes Arrtx's website, they do recommend having the pens laying horizontally rather than standing up, and that's so the paint stays a bit more even in the pen nib. And I actually tried this out. I decided I was going to leave the box upright with the pens facing upwards so the ink is not actually in the nibs to see what would happen. And it wasn't immediately noticeable, but after a day or so, I did find that the ink started to split out, and so actually these pens need to be shaken before you use them, because after the pens sat there for a while, the pigment does seem to split away from the binder a little bit, and so it will go a bit watery and not as opaque. But if you shake it up and pump the nib a few times, the ink will start to flow out nice and evenly again. It's a good idea to have a scrappy bit of paper that you can colour the pens out on to make that ink flow before you start doing your artworks again. It's just a small tip that I've observed from my own experiences here, and you'll see this in my next one. I had a little bit of an issue, but I'm just finishing this one off. I decided I'd go for a bold black outline and turn it into a cartoon mushroom, because it wasn't exactly looking very realistic to start with. And I also did a couple of layers of the white to make it really stand out. And then I decided last minute to add a cute little face, and then all I have left are some highlights to put on here, just because I like to put highlights on things. And this is pretty much the finished piece. I think this one turned out really cute, and I like the contrast of the red with the green background. Paint pens really do seem to excel with simple coloured illustrations like this one, but my last one I decided to go for something a little more complicated. This is entirely made up as well, but I decided to do a mountainscape. And I'm starting at the top with the sky, and I'll work my way down. Now this is the following day, and the pens have been sitting upright this entire time, so I thought I would just see what would happen to the ink. This blue one doesn't seem to have been affected at all. It was still nice and opaque and very smooth. Some of the other blues here were okay, but you'll see when I move down to the mountains that I had a bit of colour separation, especially with the dark grey. And you can see how messy my desk is getting. I managed to get paint pen everywhere. And you can also see how juicy these pens have become, and that's because they had split a little bit, so it's a lot of the binder and not so much of the pigment. They were spreading into each other like crazy. And this dark grey in particular ran everywhere, which potentially could have been a disaster, but I was actually using it to my favour to let the paint blend into each other naturally, and I was leaving just a very slight little line there so that it wouldn't run too much into the water. But then I remembered I wanted mountain reflections anyway, so I put some of the grey paint on there, and it was reacting a little bit funny here. It was just too much paint on there, and I just really needed to let the whole lot dry so I could then add another layer, because it was pure chaos at this point. But once it had dried, I was then able to go over all of the mountains and fix up my little mistakes and some of those runs. Plus I was trying to add in a bit of shading and make them look less two-dimensional. And I think of all of the ones I did, this one ended up being the most painterly, looking more like I'd used the brush than the actual pens themselves, and I was using that runny ink to my advantage there to let it run into each other. I think it actually created quite an interesting effect. And I've never been able to achieve this with paint pens before. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I think I might lay the pens down on this side for a while to see how they behave after I do that. Adding in a few clouds here and a few more details which I will put into the water, plus a slight white line along that little bit that I'd left just to make it look like there's water running up against the mountains. And I was going to paint trees, but I decided I liked it just like this, so this is the finished piece. And it really does look like I've used a brush for those mountains. Now the last thing I wanted to do was cover all of my dried paintings with a bit of gloss varnish, just to protect them and make everything look a bit shinier. It's just a clear acrylic polyurethane varnish that I have in my stash. There's plenty of brands out there. The one I'm using is by Jo Sonia. I actually did another project with these paint pens, but I ran out of time and I've already got enough footage for this video, so I'm actually going to do a second part which is going to come out after this one on the weekend, so stick around for that so you can see what other shenanigans I got up to. But here are the ones I got done today on the woodcuts, and I think they've turned out really nicely. I like the gloss over the top, I think that finishes them off really well, and drawing on wood slices with paint pens is really fun, so I highly recommend trying that out. You can use paint pens on all sorts of surfaces, including rocks and wood like this, paper, plant pots, all sorts of surfaces, so they're very versatile. And with this set having 72 colours, there's a big palette to choose from, and hopefully something that everyone likes. I'd love to know in the comments which is your favourite painting. I'm kind of leaning towards these mountains, although I do really like all of the ones I did. I don't hate any of them, yay! So that's everything for this video. I enjoyed using the pens. I'm not completely sold on the interchangeable nibs though, but I do really love the colour palette, and the paint quality is really good too, along with the nib mechanism at getting the paint down into them. I just wish there were 72 each of the other kinds of nibs, then it would be a perfect set. I'll give it a 9 out of 10 just for that reason. The box is also quite heavy, so this is more something to use in the studio rather than travelling with that entire box. But other than that, I really love the packaging of it and I think it looks super attractive. And my studio is rapidly filling up with all of my little artworks, but I've put them on display along with my resin chess set that I made recently. I should paint that hand as well. But that's for another time. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thank you to Arrtx for sending me these lovely markers. Messy nibs aside, I did enjoy using the actual pens themselves. I'd really appreciate a thumbs up for this video. You might want to subscribe for more videos, and I'll have another couple of videos up here for you to watch in the meantime, and be sure to stick around for part 2 coming out really soon. I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you all again soon. Swatch you later. Bye!